Retirement, they tell you, is about finding new hobbies. Golf, woodworking, traveling in an RV the size of a studio apartment. They're all wrong. Retirement is about perfecting the art of doing absolutely nothing, and doing it in glorious, high-definition surround sound. For 40 years, I designed guidance systems for things that cost more than the GDP of a small nation. I wrangled budgets, sat in meetings about synergy, and used phrases like mission-critical paradigm shift with a straight face. I spent my life sending million-dollar satellites into orbit. The least the universe owed me was a flawless signal for Season 3 of Shetland. My sanctum sanctorum, my fortress of solitude, was the leather recliner in the center of my living room. I'd spent 6 months and a significant chunk of my 401k turning the room into a home theater that would make a commercial cinema weep with envy. The 85-inch OLED, calibrated to within an inch of its life. The speakers, placed with geometric precision that would have earned me a nod of approval from Pythagoras himself. The final piece of the puzzle, the shimmering cherry on top of my monument to inertia, was a brand new K7X parabolic satellite dish. I'd installed it myself on a discreet corner of the roof, angled at the precise 34.7 degrees, needed to pull down a signal so pure you could taste the Scottish rain. This wasn't just a hunk of metal, it was a conduit to my peace. It was my hard-won steel and wire reward for a lifetime of compromises. It was perfect. And that, of course, was when the trouble started. Because in suburbia, perfect is often a direct violation of someone else's idea of acceptable. It started, as most suburban declarations of war do, with a beige envelope. It wasn't in the mailbox. That would have been too civilized. No, this was stuck to my front door with a piece of tape, fluttering in the afternoon breeze like the flag of a very boring, very passive-aggressive nation. I peeled it off, a cold dread seeping into my perfectly relaxed afternoon. Official letterhead. Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The Fun Police, I muttered. As if summoned by the dark incantation of her own organization's name, a figure appeared on the sidewalk. It was Brenda, the HOA president, being walked by a poodle named Bartholomew, who seemed to have more hair product than a 1980s rock band. She was holding a clipboard like a riot shield, her smile so tight it looked like it was about to snap. "Oh, Alex, just making my rounds," she said, her voice a sickly sweet melody of impending doom. "Did you get the little notice?" I held up the envelope. "This thing? I thought it was an ad for a cult. Join us for a life of conformity and beige-colored siding. Sounds thrilling, but I think I'll pass." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened into tiny, judgmental pebbles. "It's about the apparatus on your roof. It has come to the attention of the Architectural Review Committee." "The what? Is that you, your husband Gary, and the ceramic frog in your garden?" "The committee," she said, ignoring me, "has found it to be in violation of Bylaw 7, Section C, Paragraph 4. External fixtures not conducive to neighborhood aesthetic harmony." I stared at her. I had to give her credit. Stringing that many pompous words together was a skill. Aesthetic harmony. Brenda, your garden gnome is wearing a Speedo. Your husband wears socks with sandals. Let's not throw stones from glass houses decorated with tacky lawn ornaments, shall we? The smile finally cracked. "This is not a laughing matter, Alex. It's an eyesore. It's visible from the street, and frankly, it lowers the tone of the entire block." "It's a satellite dish, Brenda. It's not a meth lab, though I imagine a meth lab would have fewer visible wires and thus be more in line with your aesthetic harmony." "You have 14 days to remove it," she snapped, her voice losing its sugary coating. "After that, you will be subject to a fine of $50 per day. It's all in the notice." She gestured at the envelope with her clipboard. A silent, final judgment. Bartholomew the poodle yapped in agreement. She turned, clipboard held high, and marched off down the street, a one-woman parade of petty tyranny. I stood there on my porch, the beige envelope feeling heavier than it had any right to be. The war had begun. I retreated to my garage, my sanctuary of oil-stained concrete and the comforting smell of sawdust. I was fuming. This wasn't about a satellite dish. It was about control. It was about Brenda, a woman whose only power in the world came from a 3-ring binder full of rules about mailbox height and acceptable shades of taupe, trying to exert that power over me. I spent my whole life answering to people. I wasn't about to spend my retirement answering to her. I pulled up the Maple Creek Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions on my laptop. It was a 200-page PDF of pure distilled misery. I scrolled through pages of legalese, my eyes glazing over. Rules about fences, rules about trash cans, rules about the number of pets you could have, and, I kid you not, a clause about excessive or distracting holiday decorations. Then I saw it, tucked away in the section about external structures. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Brenda had quoted Bylaw 7, Section C, Paragraph 4. But I kept reading. The document was written in 1994, a time when the internet still made screeching sounds and a giant satellite dish in your yard was a status symbol. The language was incredibly specific. It listed restrictions on television reception antennas, broadcast signal receivers, and satellite dishes under 39 inches in diameter intended for the reception of subscription-based video programming. It was a loophole, a glorious, beautiful, gaping loophole. My brain, which had been enjoying a peaceful retirement of Sudoku and rewatching Blade Runner, suddenly kicked back into high gear. The old engineering gears, rusty from disuse, started to groan and turn. She wanted me to take down my dish because it wasn't harmonious? Fine. I'll give her something to be inharmonious about. Something bigger. Something that wasn't for television. Something, dare I say, scientific. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I wasn't searching for smaller, HOA-compliant satellite dishes anymore. Oh no. My revenge was going to be far more poetic. I typed in a new search query, a phrase I hadn't used in 20 years. Decommissioned scientific equipment surplus auction. The first result was a government liquidation site, a clunky, no-frills website that looked like it hadn't been updated since Netscape Navigator was a thing. I scrolled past listings for used office chairs and military-grade filing cabinets, and then I found it. My breath caught in my throat. Lot hash 734, 11, 25-foot diameter, fully articulated radio telescope dish. Parabolic reflector. Prime focus feed horn assembly included. As is where is. Buyer responsible for transport and disassembly. A slow, evil, magnificent smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that meant someone was about to solve a very complex problem in the most gloriously over-the-top way imaginable. "Game on, Brenda," I whispered to the empty garage. "Game on." The next 72 hours were a blur of obsessive, caffeine-fueled research. My man cave was transformed from a relaxation den into a mission control center. My 85-inch screen, once dedicated to gritty British detectives, now displayed a dizzying array of browser tabs, structural engineering forums, PDF manuals for Cold War-era servo motors, freight logistics company websites, and YouTube tutorials on pouring deep pier concrete foundations. This was no longer about spite. Well, it was mostly about spite. But a new, exhilarating element had been introduced. This was an engineering challenge of the highest order. For the first time since I'd cleaned out my desk, I felt truly, incandescently alive. I found the original manufacturer's schematics on a dusty corner of the internet, archived by some university astronomy club. The dish and its mount weighed a combined 12 tons. 12 tons. My meticulously manicured lawn was about to have a very bad day. I finally worked up the nerve to call the contact number on the auction website. A man with a voice that sounded like it ran on gravel and cheap coffee answered on the fourth ring. "Surplus, Dave speaking." "Hello," I said, trying to sound like a legitimate buyer and not a man on the verge of a suburban midlife crisis. "I'm interested in lot #734, the radio telescope. Can you tell me if the azimuth and elevation motors are still functional?" There was a long pause on the other end, punctuated by the distinct sound of someone chewing a sandwich. "Buddy," Dave finally said, "I can tell you it's big and it's metal. The paperwork says it turned on in 2012. You want it? You gotta come get it from the site in Nevada. We don't do tech support." "And the feed horn assembly? Is it for the C-band or Q-band?" Another pause. "It's the pointy thing in the middle. Look, you want the thing or not? Auction closes tomorrow at noon." He sounded about as interested in my questions as a cat is in calculus. That settled it. This was a wild, untamed beast, and I was going to be its new owner. The online auction was the most stressful thing I'd done in years. I watched the countdown clock tick down, my heart pounding. With 5 minutes to go, a new bidder appeared. AstroGeek 88. We went back and forth, the price climbing higher than I'd budgeted. AstroGeek 88 was persistent. I imagined some pimply teenager in his mom's basement, dreaming of discovering aliens. "Sorry, kid. This piece of scientific history was being repurposed for a higher calling." Pettiness. With 10 seconds left, I took a deep breath, typed in a number that made my wallet scream, and hit Confirm Bid. The timer hit 0. A green banner flashed across the screen. "Congratulations, you are the winner of lot #734. The "Congratulations" email popped up a moment later. I had just purchased 12 tons of high-grade aluminum and steel that was currently sitting in the middle of the Nevada desert. For a fleeting moment, I felt the crushing, astronomical weight of my own stupidity. What had I done? This was insane. Then I pictured Brenda's smug little face and her clipboard of doom. The feeling passed. This was happening. The first sign that my plan was slightly outside the suburban norm came when I started calling construction companies. "Hi, yes, I need a quote on a foundation." "Sure thing, pal. For a deck? A garage extension?" "Not exactly. It's for a 25-foot radio telescope." Click. The first 3 calls ended that way. The fourth contractor laughed for a solid minute before politely telling me he was booked for the next 2 years. I was starting to lose hope when I stumbled upon a small, independent outfit with a no-frills website, W&M Concrete and Construction. No job too weird. That sounded promising. The next day, a dusty Ford F-250 pulled into my driveway. 2 men got out. The first, Walt, was in his 60s, with a face like a road map of every construction site in the state, and hands that looked like they could crush granite. The second, Miguel, was maybe half his age, with a tablet in his hand and an air of weary amusement. They were uncle and nephew. I invited them into the kitchen and spread the blueprints across the table. Walt squinted at them, then looked at me, then back at the blueprints. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You want a 10-foot deep steel-reinforced concrete pier in the middle of your petunias to hold up a giant metal ear?" "Essentially, yes," I said, trying to sound professional. The pier needs to be engineered to handle a significant wind load and the dynamic torque of the positioning motors. I've already run the calculations for the soil density in this area. Miguel, who had been silently swiping through the plans on his tablet, finally looked up. His eyes were wide. "Dude, are you building a Death Star?" I gave him my best deadpan stare. "The HOA has very strict rules about planet-destroying superweapons. No, this is purely for amateur radio astronomy, a hobby." Walt let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. He walked over to the window and looked out at my pristine backyard, the future home of his concrete monolith. "A hobby, right. And I'm the Queen of England." He turned back to me, a glint of something, not mockery, but maybe, just maybe, respect in his eye. "This is the dumbest, most glorious thing I've ever seen. What's the budget?" I told him. He whistled, a long, low sound. "For that price," Walt said, "I'd pour you a foundation to launch the space shuttle." He stuck out a calloused hand. "All right, crazy man. You've got yourself a contractor. Let's build your giant metal ear." Miguel just shook his head, already typing furiously into his tablet. "I'm going to have to write up a whole new liability waiver for this," he muttered. "I'm calling it the Act of God and/or Spite clause." I had my team. Getting the city permit was an exercise in strategic obfuscation. I learned a long time ago that bureaucrats are like T-Rexes. Their vision is based on movement. If you stand perfectly still and use the right camouflage, they won't even see you. I marched into the city planning office, blueprints in hand, and filled out the application not for a radio telescope, which would have triggered a dozen committees, but for an amateur radio tower foundation. It wasn't technically a lie. It was just a very, very abbreviated version of the truth. The clerk, a young woman who looked profoundly bored with her existence, glanced at it, saw the engineering stamp I'd paid extra for, and slammed it with an approval stamp. Victory. A week later, the war on Brenda's aesthetic harmony began in earnest. A bright yellow backhoe rolled down our quiet suburban street at 7 in the morning and proceeded to turn my award-winning lawn into a passable imitation of a World War I trench. The noise was apocalyptic. Neighbors started emerging from their houses, blinking in the morning sun, coffee mugs in hand. Brenda was at her window in an instant, a pair of binoculars pressed to her face. My next-door neighbor, Jim, a nice enough guy who considered a perfectly edged lawn the pinnacle of human achievement, wandered over to the growing pit. "Hey, Alex," he yelled over the roar of the engine. "Putting in a pool?" "Something like that," I yelled back. "More of a reflecting pool." Just then, Brenda marched across the lawn, her face a thundercloud. "Alex, what is the meaning of this? You need HOA approval for any major landscaping. This is a clear violation." I was ready for her. I calmly walked over, pulled the freshly stamped city permit from a folder, and handed it to her. "Brenda, this isn't landscaping. This is a foundation. The bylaws, as I'm sure you know, are silent on the issue of foundations for hobbyist structures. I checked." She snatched the permit, her eyes scanning it frantically for a flaw. Finding none, she thrust it back at me, her face turning a fascinating shade of magenta. She spun on her heel and stormed back to her house without another word. Round two to me, the main event was the concrete pour. Not one, not two, but 3 enormous cement trucks rumbled down the street, blocking it completely. It was a suburban apocalypse. Kids on bikes stopped to stare. Cars honked. Walt and Miguel, looking completely unfazed, directed the whole chaotic ballet with hand signals and the occasional shout. The chute was lowered, and a thick, gray river of concrete began to pour into the steel-reinforced hole in my yard. It was mesmerizing. This wasn't just concrete. It was the physical manifestation of my spite. It was a 12-ton middle finger to the Maple Creek Estates Architectural Review Committee. And it was beautiful. Delivery day was a spectacle. At 9 a.m., the rumbling started. It wasn't just one truck, it was a convoy. 3 massive flatbed trucks, the kind that usually haul wind turbine blades, navigated the tight corners of my neighborhood with agonizing slowness. On their beds, shrouded in heavy blue tarps, were the pieces of my magnificent beast. The dish itself, even wrapped up, looked like a captured UFO. The entire neighborhood was outside. People were on their lawns, phones out, recording the slow-motion invasion. The trucks ground to a halt in front of my house, blocking the street from curb to curb. Predictably, the flashing lights appeared within minutes. A police cruiser pulled up. Out stepped 2 officers, a fresh-faced rookie who looked about 15, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, and a grizzled veteran sergeant who looked like he'd been woken up from a very important nap. The rookie, Officer Davis, approached me cautiously. Sir, we're getting calls about— Well, we're not sure what we're getting calls about. A spaceship crash? I calmly handed him a manila folder containing the bill of sale, the government surplus documentation, and the oversized load transport permits I'd spent a week securing. No crash, officers. Just a delivery. It's a garden sculpture. The veteran, Sergeant Miller, took the folder. He glanced at the first page, then looked up at the tarp-covered behemoth on the truck, then back at the paperwork. He looked at me, and a slow, beautiful grin spread across his face. He'd seen it all, and he recognized a fellow practitioner of the art of malicious compliance when he saw one. A garden sculpture, he said, handing the folder back. Right. He tipped his hat to me. Well, your paperwork's in order, Mr. Henderson. Try not to block the road all day. He turned and walked back to the cruiser, chuckling to himself. Officer Davis just stood there, his mouth slightly agape, utterly bewildered. The main event was the crane. It arrived an hour later, its arm unfolding and reaching into the sky, towering over the houses. A crew of workers swarmed the trucks, unstrapping the cargo. With agonizing slowness, the crane lifted the first piece, the massive 10-ton pedestal mount, into the air, swung it over my roof, and lowered it onto the waiting concrete pier in the backyard. There was a deafening clang as steel met steel, followed by the roar of pneumatic wrenches bolting it into place. The scale of the project was now terrifyingly, gloriously clear to everyone. This was not a garden sculpture. This was a statement. From her window, Brenda watched, her face pale. The game had changed. Assembling the telescope was like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube the size of a garage, with the instructions written in a dead language. The schematics I'd downloaded were 40-year-old military blueprints, complete with coffee stains and cryptic handwritten notes. For the next 2 weeks, my backyard was a chaotic symphony of clanging metal, shouted questions, and the occasional string of creative profanity. "All right," Walt would yell, wiping grease from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. "According to this, bolt C47 connects to flange plate gamma. I have 3 bolts labeled C, and nothing here that looks remotely like a gamma." "The torque specifications are in foot-pounds," I'd reply, squinting at a faded diagram. "But they were written by a guy named Werner, so I'm assuming they're more of a strong suggestion than a hard rule." Miguel, meanwhile, was tasked with sorting the miles of thick, industrial cables. He held up 2 massive, identical-looking red connectors. "Hey, Alex, does this one go to the primary actuator, or the one that makes it self-destruct? Because the label is just a drawing of a skull and crossbones." Through the shared frustration, a strange camaraderie was forged. We were a band of brothers in a war against physics and poor documentation. Every evening, after the day's battle, we'd sit on the tailgate of Walt's truck, covered in grime and hydraulic fluid, and share a cooler of beer. Walt, who had initially seen me as some rich eccentric, started treating me like a fellow engineer. He respected my calculations, and I respected his uncanny ability to make 12 tons of uncooperative steel do what he wanted. We were speaking the same language, a dialect of torque wrenches and load-bearing capacities. It was during one of these sessions that I gained an unlikely ally. A kid from next door, maybe 15, had been hovering at the edge of my property for days, watching with wide, curious eyes. He was skinny, with a mop of unruly hair and thick glasses. Finally, he got up the nerve to approach. "Whoa," he breathed, staring at the half-assembled dish. "Is that a Cassegrain reflector? What's its focal length?" I was floored. Most kids his age could tell you the specs on the latest iPhone, not the optical configuration of a radio telescope. "It is," I said, genuinely impressed. "It's an F4. You know your stuff, kid." His name was Leo. He was a bona fide space nerd, the president of his high school's tiny astronomy club. To him, the mechanical monster in my backyard wasn't an instrument of spite. It was the coolest thing he had ever seen in his life. From that day on, Leo became part of the crew. He'd show up after school, running errands, cleaning parts, and asking a million questions. At first, I was my usual curmudgeonly self, but his infectious enthusiasm started to wear me down. I found myself explaining the principles of radio interferometry and the challenges of filtering out terrestrial noise. I was teaching again, mentoring. It felt good. For the first time in a couple of years, my world was about more than just myself. It now included a grizzled contractor, his tech-savvy nephew, and a nerdy kid who looked at the sky with genuine wonder. While I was forging new friendships, Brenda was busy weaponizing her clipboard. My front door became a bulletin board for her passive-aggressive fury. A new beige envelope appeared almost daily. Violation notice, noise pollution, construction. Violation notice, improper storage of industrial materials, telescope parts on lawn. Violation notice, unapproved alteration to landscape grading. I didn't even bother opening them anymore. I just slipped them into a growing file in my desk drawer labeled Brenda's Fan Mail. Her paper-based attacks having failed, she escalated. A notice went up in the community clubhouse. Emergency HOA meeting to discuss the unsanctioned industrial installation at 124 Maple Creek Lane. She was going for a public shaming. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. It felt like a town hall in a bad sitcom. On one side, you had Brenda's loyalists, the concerned citizens for a beige tomorrow, who were clutching their pearls and muttering about property values. On the other side, you had the silent majority, the ones who were secretly enjoying the drama and saw me as a folk hero. Brenda stood at a podium, launching into a tirade about harmony, aesthetics, and the sanctity of the bylaws. Then she opened the floor for discussion. It was my turn. I walked to the front, not with anger, but with a laptop and a small projector. Leo was with me, carrying a laser pointer like it was a lightsaber. "Good evening, everyone," I began as I connected my laptop. "Brenda is correct. I have erected a structure in my yard. But let's consult the bylaws she holds so dear, shall we?" I projected the infamous Bylaw 7, Section C, onto the screen behind me. "As you can see," I said, using the laser pointer to highlight the text, "it specifies restrictions on dishes for the reception of television broadcasts. My structure, however, is not for television. It is a scientific instrument for my hobby of amateur radio astronomy." A murmur went through the crowd. "Furthermore," I continued, clicking to the next slide, "the bylaws are designed to prevent eyesores that serve no purpose. But my project has a purpose beyond my own enjoyment." I nodded to Leo. The kid stepped forward, nervous but determined. He spoke passionately about the educational value of the telescope. He talked about looking at Jupiter's moons, listening to the echoes of pulsars, and how he and his astronomy club could learn from it. He wasn't talking about property values. He was talking about the stars. He made it sound not like a violation, but like a community asset, a private observatory for the neighborhood. The meeting ended in chaos. The motion to formally censure me and pursue legal action was voted down. Several parents came up to me afterward, asking if their kids could come see the telescope when it was done. Brenda stood by the podium, her face ashen. She had been publicly outmaneuvered and humiliated. Her power base was shattered. Her vendetta was no longer official HOA business. It was now brutally, furiously personal. The final weeks of assembly were a frantic push. With Leo's help deciphering some of the more esoteric electronic diagrams, we finally connected the last of the servo motors and ran the thick coaxial cables into my garage. The dish was complete. It stood against the sky like a modern-day Stonehenge, a gleaming white monument to a grudge well-nursed. It towered over my house, over the neighbor's house, over the entire block. It was terrifying and beautiful. My garage no longer looked like a place to park a car. It had become a NASA control room on a budget. Old computer monitors I'd salvaged from an e-waste pile flickered to life. Wires snaked across the floor. An old beige IBM computer, the only thing I could find that still had the right serial port to communicate with the 1980 S-era control board, hummed away in the corner. The moment of truth arrived on a clear Saturday afternoon. Me, Walt, Miguel, and Leo stood crowded around the console, the garage door open to the backyard. "Okay," I said, my hand hovering over a large red breaker switch on a panel I'd wired myself. "Primary power is a go. Everybody stand back." I flipped the switch. A series of relays clicked loudly, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air, seeming to come from the very ground beneath our feet. "Is it supposed to make that noise?" Miguel asked nervously. "That's the sound of 12 tons of freedom, Miguel," I said with a grin. I sat down at the old IBM, the screen glowing with a green, text-only command prompt. My fingers, trembling slightly, typed the first command. Initiate_azimuth_calibration_sequence. I hit enter. For a second, nothing happened. Then, from the backyard came a low groan, like a sleeping giant stirring. We all rushed out of the garage. With a powerful, majestic whir, the massive dish began to move. It rotated smoothly on its base, the motors surprisingly quiet, sweeping across the horizon. We just stood there, 4 unlikely co-conspirators, staring up in silent, slack-jawed awe. I typed another command, set_elevation 90. The dish responded instantly, tilting its giant face straight up towards the heavens. It worked. It actually worked. From across the street, I saw a flicker of movement. It was the blind in Brenda's living room window, snapping shut. But it was too late. The shadow of my magnificent, fully operational battle station had already swept across her house. I had severely underestimated the power of a bored teenager with a smartphone. Leo, bless his nerdy heart, had been making a time-lapse video of the entire construction process. The day after we powered it on, he edited it together with some dramatic, space-themed music and posted it on TikTok. I didn't even know what TikTok was. I found out when my phone started buzzing and refused to stop. The video exploded. It was the perfect viral storm, a quirky David versus Goliath story, a cool science project, and the satisfying visual of something enormous being built in a place it clearly didn't belong. The story got picked up by a local news blog, then a real TV station. The headline was "Suburban Man Battles HOA with Science." Hashtags started trending. #TelescopeGuy, #HOA Wars, #SpiteScience. The next afternoon, a news van pulled up in front of my house. A reporter with impossibly white teeth and a microphone that looked like a black ice cream cone bounded up my driveway. Her name was Tiffany. My first instinct was to tell her to get off my lawn, which was now mostly a patch of dirt and regret. But Leo intercepted her, his eyes shining. "It's a great opportunity to tell your side of the story," he whispered to me. So I found myself blinking into a camera lens, with Tiffany asking me bubbly questions. "So, Alex," she chirped, "what inspired this incredible project?" I looked straight into the camera. "A deep and abiding passion for aesthetic harmony," I said, my face completely straight, "and the British Broadcasting Corporation." "And what do you hope to find with this amazing device? Are you looking for aliens?" "No," I said, shaking my head gravely. "My primary mission is to locate a dimension where a man can watch his programs in peace. The search continues." The interview, which was supposed to be a quirky human interest piece, became a masterclass in deadpan absurdity. The story went national. I was Telescope Guy, an instant folk hero for anyone who had ever received a passive-aggressive note about their trash cans. People started driving by the house, slowing down to take pictures. I had wanted to be left alone, and in my quest for solitude, I had accidentally turned my house into a tourist attraction. The irony was not lost on me. Amidst the chaos of my newfound local fame, the real work began. The nights were for science. After the sun went down and the neighborhood grew quiet, Leo and I would retreat to the garage, our mission control. We'd close the door, the green glow of the monitors casting long shadows on the walls. The air would fill with the low hum of the machinery and the gentle hiss of the cosmos coming through the speakers. It was magical. We tracked the International Space Station as it silently streaked across the sky. We aimed the dish at Jupiter and, through a complex process of data conversion, managed to hear the crackle of its powerful magnetic field. We listened to the faint, rhythmic pulse of a star that had died millions of years ago. It was a profound and humbling experience. In the quiet darkness of the garage, the petty squabble with Brenda seemed impossibly small. One Tuesday night, we were scanning a patch of sky in the constellation Ophiuchus, a region known for being relatively quiet. We were just taking baseline readings. The speaker hissed with the usual white noise, the background radiation left over from the birth of the universe. And then something else came through. It was faint, barely audible above the static, but it was there, a repeating pattern, a faint, rhythmic beep, beep, beep. "Whoa," Leo whispered. "What's that?" My heart started pounding. My engineer's brain, the one that had been dormant for so long, snapped to attention. This wasn't natural. Natural signals, pulsars, quasars, had a different signature. This was clean. It was artificial. "Get a recording," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm going to triangulate." For the next 2 hours, we worked in a state of intense, focused excitement. We tracked the signal's source as the Earth rotated, gathering data points. I scribbled equations on a whiteboard, calculating its trajectory, its Doppler shift. It was moving, but not like a modern satellite in a predictable orbit. This was a long, slow, outbound arc, an old arc. After running the data through a public database of known satellites and space probes, and coming up with nothing, a wild idea began to form in my mind. I dug into NASA's deep archives, pulling up mission data from the 1970s. And there it was, a trajectory that matched almost perfectly. "I don't believe it," I breathed, leaning back in my chair. "What? Is it aliens?" Leo asked, his eyes wide. "No," I said, a slow grin spreading across my face. "Not aliens. Something much, much cooler." The signal was from the Pioneer 10 probe. Launched in 1972, It was the first spacecraft to traverse the asteroid belt and make direct observations of Jupiter. NASA had lost contact with it in 2003. It was supposed to be a dead, silent ghost, drifting endlessly toward the star Aldebaran. But somehow, after 2 decades of silence, a random cosmic ray or a solar flare must have short-circuited a backup system, rebooting its simple, primitive beacon. We had found a zombie satellite. The next morning, I made a phone call. My old roommate from Caltech, a guy named Dr. Robert Patterson, was now a high-level mission director at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. "Bob, it's Alex Henderson." "Alex, you old son of a gun! I heard you retired. How's life without deadlines?" "It has its moments. Listen, Bob, I'm going to ask you a strange question. Are you guys still listening for Pioneer 10? There was a pause. "Pioneer? Alex, we lost the signal on that thing 20 years ago. The power source is long dead. Why?" "Because," I said, taking a sip of my coffee, "I think I've got it. Faint, but it's there. I'm sending you the data." I emailed him everything. Our recordings, my calculations, the exact coordinates in the sky. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Bob. He sounded completely different. "Alex," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "Where in God's name did you get a radio telescope big enough to hear this?" The official confirmation came a week later. The Deep Space Network aimed its massive dishes where I told them to, and they heard it too. It was faint, but it was unmistakably the long-lost probe. A few weeks after that, an official NASA press release hit the news wires. It announced the stunning rediscovery of the historic Pioneer 10 probe, and there, in the 3rd paragraph, was a sentence that made my heart sing. "Credit for the initial detection goes to Mr. Alex Henderson, an amateur radio astronomer in California, whose private observations led to the rediscovery." I printed the article. I walked out my front door, across the street, and over to the community clubhouse. There, on the official HOA bulletin board, nestled between a flyer for a lost cat and a sign-up sheet for the annual potluck, Brenda had posted yet another angry notice about my structure. I didn't say a word. I took 4 thumbtacks from the little cup and carefully, precisely, pinned the NASA press release right over the top of her notice. A perfect checkmate. No arguments, no shouting. Just a quiet, unassailable victory, certified by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. I turned and walked away, not even bothering to look back. Life settled into a new kind of normal. The telescope, once a symbol of my war with the HOA, slowly became just a part of the landscape. It was a landmark. "Turn left at the house with the giant space dish," people would say. The initial flurry of news crews and looky-loos died down, replaced by a quiet, grudging acceptance, which in suburbia is as close to a ticker tape parade as you're going to get. More importantly, my life was no longer a fortress of solitude. It had been breached, and I found I didn't mind. Walt and Miguel still came by for beers, though now their talk was less about concrete and more about their latest jobs. "Nothing as good as the telescope job, though," Walt would always say with a wink. Leo was a permanent fixture. My garage became his after-school hangout. We were tracking a near-Earth asteroid for his science fair project. I had a feeling it was going to terrify the judges and probably win him a scholarship to MIT. He had gone from being the shy kid next door to my co-pilot on our nightly voyages into the cosmos. I even started hosting starry night parties for the neighborhood kids. I'd set up speakers in the backyard, and they'd lie on blankets on the new sod, listening to the hiss of distant galaxies. I'd show them the data on a laptop, explaining what they were hearing. I had become the neighborhood's eccentric, cool science grandpa. It was a role I had never asked for, but one I was starting to enjoy. I had waged a war for privacy and, in winning, had accidentally built a community. I'm sitting on my back porch at dusk, a cold beer sweating in my hand. The massive white dish is silhouetted against a sky streaked with orange and purple, turning slowly, almost imperceptibly, to track a new target Leo had recommended. The hum of its motors is no longer a sound of defiance, but a comforting, familiar presence. It's the background music to my retirement. My phone buzzes on the table beside me. A text from Leo. "Saturn is in a great position tonight. Rings should be super clear." I smile and text back, "On it, bring snacks." I take a long sip of my beer. I got my peace and quiet, just not in the way I expected. Turns out the universe is a pretty noisy place, filled with dying stars and forgotten probes and the crackle of distant storms on other worlds. And you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way. Across the street, I see Brenda walking Bartholomew. Our eyes meet for a split second. There's no anger in her face anymore, just a kind of weary resignation. She deliberately looks away, picking up her pace. I raise my bottle in a silent, triumphant toast to her retreating back. "Aesthetic harmony," I mutter to myself with a smirk, before heading back inside to see what the universe has to say.